Hi everyone. Today we are going to have a look at creating a library in Cinema 4D. Starting a new library is a pretty simple task and there's not that much to tell really. In order to make things a little more interesting, I'm going to do a project-based tutorial on creating libraries that contain a large number of objects and how we can make the process of creating such a library more efficient. If you're like me, you've probably collected or modeled quite a few objects over the years. When working on a project, you can really save a lot of time if you can quickly access a wide selection of objects and pick one or more that are suitable for a particular project. Personally, I like to organize my objects in libraries in the Cinema 4D content browser. In this video, I'm going to show you what I do to get those objects into a library. In this tutorial, we're going to create a library full of splines, and splines can be useful in many situations, be it for modeling or motion graphics. So I thought that splines would make a good example for creating such a library. You will need Cinema 4D Broadcast or Studio because we're going to use Mograph. Also, I'll be using a free plugin for this project which is called Batch Rename Objects. And this is a plugin by Adam Swab that has been around for quite a few years. For what we need to do, it'll be much more useful than Cinema 4D's naming tool. I have posted a link to the plugin in the video description, and you will also find a link to the project file we will be using in this video. Once you've downloaded the project file and installed the free plugin, we can get started. If you open the circular shapes start file, you will see that we have a number of splines in here, and these are splines that I created based on reference images a while ago. If I switch on solo mode and go to viewport solo selection, I can select each of these splines and all of the other ones will be made invisible. So here you can see the individual shapes. Before we put these splines into a library, there's a few things I want to check. So I'm doing a final quality check of these splines. First of all, I'm going to select all the splines and make sure that each of them has the default resolution of 5 degrees. Depending on the type of library that you want to create, you may have very small objects and you may have very big objects. So now would also be a good time to change all of your objects to the final size. For the library we're going to create, we don't need different sizes for the objects. So I'm going to make all of these more or less the same size, and I'm going to use a Cinema 4D circle as a reference. And you can see this default circle spline has a diameter of 400 by 400. So that's what I'm going to use for all of my splines. And I'm going to select each one of them and change the size to 400 by 400. And I'll do this for the rest of the splines. I'm going to pause the video now because that's very boring, and I'll come back when I've finished rescaling my splines. Okay, I'm back and I have rescaled all of my splines to 400 by 400. I saw that some of these splines are still a bit smaller for some reason, but that's fine for this project. We'll probably need to make adjustments to those slightly smaller splines when we set everything up for rendering the preview images. There's one thing I found with this spline here. If you take a look down here in the coordinates manager, you can see that the size on the z-axis is not 0, which means that the points of this spline are not in the same plane. I'm just going to change that to 0 and hit apply to fix that spline. Now these splines are ready to be added to a library, but before we do that, we need to rename all of these splines. In order to rename the splines, I'm going to use the free plugin I mentioned at the beginning of the video, which is called Batch Rename Objects by Adam Swab. Unfortunately, that is a coffee plugin, so if you're using Cinema 4D Release 20 or newer, this plugin will probably not work anymore. And for some of you, that will be a bit of a bummer because I haven't found an alternative to that old plugin by Adam Swab. In any case, I'm going to rename the splines using that plugin, and in order to do that, I'm going to select all of the splines and then bring up that batch rename objects plugin, and we have only a couple of options here, but this tool is extremely useful for renaming a lot of objects. You can see here we have a start number, and we're going to start with number 1, and we can pick a format. And because I have more than 9 splines, I'm going to change the format to 2 digits. You can also have 3 or 4 digits if you want to, but 2 will be enough here. And then we need to enter a name. And for these splines, I'm going to use circular underscore shape underscore. And if I hit OK, all of these splines will be renamed to circular shape, and then they will receive a consecutive number starting at number 1. And if I hit OK, you can see nothing happens, and that's because you need to left click somewhere to update the viewport. So now we have our splines, they're all properly named, and we can now add them to a library. And what I'll do in order to put these into a library is I'm going to select all of the splines and then go to my content browser, and I'll make this smaller. And we need to go to the presets folder and then go to file and create a new preset library. And I'm going to rename this library to tutorial large libraries. And this will create an empty folder, and we can now drag and drop our splines into this folder. And you can see the splines will be added and they will be ordered according to their name, and Cinema 4D will create a default preview that is based on the default camera in the perspective view. And while this preview is certainly helpful, it's not very useful, especially if you use splines. For one thing, the shape of the splines cannot really be seen, and also the objects are way too small. They should fill in as much of that square space as possible. And what I like to do is I like to create my own custom previews for the libraries, and that's what we're going to do next. If you go to Edit, Browser Preferences, you will get the Cinema 4D Preferences window, and here under the Content Browser tab you can make a few adjustments. And for my content browser, I have set the thumbnail preview to 512 by 512. I think the default is half that number, so it's 256 by 256, I think. And I set the quality to high, and that's because I like to get nice and big previews. The size of the preview images will not increase the library size too much, so that's not going to be a problem, especially since we're going to render out JPEGs. So let's go ahead and create those preview images. I have saved my file under a new name. You can see that this name is Circular Shapes for Preview Renders. And the reason I created this new file is because depending on the library, you will have objects that have very different sizes. However, for the preview renders, we need the objects to be about the same size. All of these need to fit into a square area, and we want to make sure that each of these objects fits as closely as possible to that square format. I think I've mentioned before that some of these splines are a little bit smaller than the other ones, although I scaled them to 400 by 400. And the splines concerned are splines 11 to 14. If I go to my front view and add a cube, and I'll change that to 400 by 400 by 400, I still have solo mode switched on. If I hold down shift and left click on one of the splines, it will make both of these objects visible, and you can see that the first spline fits right into that square shape here. If I deselect that and select shape 11, you can see that it's a little bit smaller. So we're going to change the size of these 4 splines, and I've already tested that, and I'm going to make these 428 by 428. So now if I select both of these objects, you can see these ones are fitting into that square shape as well. We can now delete this cube again, and I'm going to switch off solo mode. Next, what we're going to do is we need to make these splines visible when we render them. Right now we don't have any geometry, so we're going to get a black render. And in order to make these visible, I'm going to use an extrude object. Because we're going to do a render from the front, we don't need any depth, so I'm going to change the extrude object to 0. Of course, we need extrude objects for all of these splines, and fortunately for us, Cinema 4D has an option in the extrude object that will make it possible to extrude all of these splines. So I'm going to make these children of the extrude object, and in the extrude object I'm going to switch on the hierarchical option. And right now that is not going to be very helpful because everything's going to be extruded and rendered. So we need each of these objects to be a single extrude object. And with the hierarchical option checked, I can make this extrude object editable. And what I will get is 22 new extrude objects, which will already be named according to the name of the splines. And that's really helpful and speeds up things quite a bit. In order to make things more efficient, we're not going to hide all of the objects, render one, then hide that rendered object, and unhide the next one to render that. We don't want to do that. What we're going to do instead is we're going to render out an image sequence. And in order to be able to do that, we're going to use a cloner and an effector. So let's go ahead and add a cloner object. And I'll make all of these extrude objects children of the cloner. For that cloner, we need to make only 2 changes. For one thing, we need to change the clones from iterate to sort. And because we have 22 objects, we need to change the count to 22. And we're going to render out 1 frame or 1 image for each of these objects. So what I'm also going to do is I'm going to change the timeline to frame 1. And we need 22 images, that is 22 frames. So now we have the timeline that goes from frame 1 to frame 22. Now if I render this cloner, you can see, like with the extrude object, only the first child gets rendered. And if I move on to the next frame, it's the same. So we're only getting a render of that first object. And in order to change that and to make each of these objects visible on a separate frame, we're going to need an effector. And with the cloner object selected, I'm going to add a plane effector. And for that plane effector, I'm going to switch off position. We don't need that. The only thing that we need for our plane effector is the modify clone option, and we're going to animate that. So I'm going to set a keyframe at 0% at frame 1, and then I'm going to jump to the end of the animation, which is frame 22, and I'm going to increase that to 100%, and I'm going to add another keyframe. By default, animations in Cinema 4D have an ease in, ease out option. What I actually mean is the animation is an ease in, ease out animation by default. We need to change that because if we have an ease in and ease out, that means we're going to get duplicate images of some of the splines at the beginning and at the end. And in order to change that, I'm going to right click on modify clone, go to animation and show F curve. And you can see we're getting this F curve, which eases in and eases out. I'm going to hit Ctrl A to select all the points, and I'm going to switch those points to linear. And now if I go back to frame 1, you can see I have that first child, and if I progress through the timeline, I'll make each of these clones visible one after the other. So that is exactly what we need. If I render this, the object is a bit dark and I want to change that. So I'm going to create a new material, and for this material I'm going to switch off reflectance, and I'm going to change the color mode from Lambertian to Orinear, which will be less reflective, and I'm going to change this to 100% white, and I'm going to put that material on the cloner. So now we're getting an image like this. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a camera, and I'm going to position the camera at 0. And I can do that easily by going to Character, Commands, Reset Position Scale and Rotation. So now we have the camera here at this position. If we go into that camera and hit H on the keyboard, we will frame the entire scene. So this is what we're going to get for the render. Because we need a square format, we need to go to the render settings by hitting Ctrl B, and on the output tab I'm going to switch off log ratio and I'm going to change the size to 512 by 512. And I'm also going to change the frame range to all frames. If you go to your viewport settings by hitting Shift V, and if you go to the View tab, you can switch on the Render Save option. And let's go ahead and bring the opacity up to 100%. I'm going to hit H on the keyboard again to frame that scene. And for now, let's just switch the frame range back to current frame. I'm going to do a render to the picture viewer. So this is what we have right now. Let's go ahead and go back to the first frame. If you want to, you can zoom in a little further. And since we have the opacity of the render region switched to 100%, we can fine-tune this and fill out as much of that square area as possible. So maybe let's do something like this. I'm going back to the render settings and I'm going to switch that back to all frames. Let's do a quick test and render the animation to the picture viewer. And this should go fairly quickly. I just want to make sure that I'm actually only getting one image for each of the 22 splines. So let's just scroll through here, and that is looking good. Now you can see that the splines or the objects are named 1 to 22, but I do want the names of the actual objects, the names that they have here in the object manager. And as far as I know, I can't do that when I render to the picture viewer, but what we can do is go to the render settings and go to save. What we're going to do is we're going to render these images to a specific location, and you can do that by clicking on that button. I've already created a preview folder, or a preview images folder rather, for this project. And what I need to do is I need to enter a file name, and I'm going to call this circular underscore shape underscore and save this. So now we have the file path and the file name, and down here we can specify a format. I'm going to keep the default format. Unfortunately, we can't switch that to 2 digits like we did when we renamed the splines, but that's fine. And I think that is everything we need to do. The last change I'm going to make is I'm going to change the spline resolution for the renders to the maximum detail. Right now, all of the splines are set to the default of 5 degrees. Let's go ahead and click on this button here, and we can now search for objects, and I'm going to search for splines. I'm going to double click on spline here. This will select all the splines. I can now left click here, and I can change all splines to the maximum detail. Okay, so all of these now have an angle of 0 degrees, which means if I render this, it will be perfectly smooth. So now let's hit render, and Cinema 4D will render the image sequence. This will be a little bit slower because I've increased the resolution to the maximum detail. So here we go. That took a little bit, and now we have our 22 objects all rendered, and they still have only the number here. But if I switch to the folder where I saved these images, you can see we have all of these images in there now. And unfortunately, I forgot to change the file format from TIFF to JPEG. If you go to the render settings, go to save, this is where you change the format. I'm not going to do this again to save a little bit of time, but you can change that to JPEG here if you want to, and hopefully that will make the file size of the JPEG images a little bit smaller. I'll just pause the video and render out that image sequence again. Okay, so the image sequence has been rendered. If I switch back to my Windows Explorer, you can see the JPEGs are a lot smaller than the TIFF images. I'm going to sort them by type, and I'll just delete all the TIFF images here. So now we have our JPEGs, and these are the preview images that we're going to use as the previews in our library. So finally, we can start adding our preview images to the objects in our library. The bad news is that we cannot drag and drop all of these images onto the objects and replace the default previews that Cinema 4D created. So this part of creating the library is a very tedious task, and if you have a lot of objects, unfortunately there is no other way but to do this one image at a time. You can see here I've opened the Cinema 4D content browser and resized it, and I've also opened the Windows Explorer and resized that too. What we can do is we can drag and drop an image in there. However, it's going to be added as a JPEG image, but we can't drag and drop the image onto the object and replace the preview image. I'm just going to right click and delete that image again from the library. What we need to do instead is select each object, right click, and by the way, I've changed the view to list. Previously it was on icons. If you right click, you can change that here. So I'm displaying this as the list, which shows the image and the file name next to the image. So what we need to do is select each of these objects in the library, right click and choose set preview. And then you need to navigate to the folder where you saved your images and double click on the image, and it's going to be added as the preview. So I'm going to do that quickly for each of these objects here. Actually, I'm just going to pause the video because, again, this is very boring and you don't need to watch me doing this. So I'm back again, and I've added all of the preview images to the corresponding spline shapes, and our library is now finished. So if I make this content browser full screen, you can click on each of these shapes. You get a nice and big preview here. And if I make that smaller, and I'll just open a new file, you can now double click and add whatever object you need or want to your scene. So this is the end of this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you again soon.